What did you think about the strike yesterday? What are your thoughts on it?
For the past couple of months, journalist Nate Freriedman has been all over the internet. Here's how he does it. He goes to protests, mainly anti-Israel / pro-Hamas, and exposes the fact that there is much more centralization and dark money in the anti-Israel protests than any of us might realize. Here is an example.
Excuse me, sir. He's a Zionist. He's not going to talk about it.
Wait, what's that?
Do not engage with him, please.
You're a Zionist?
Yes.
Am I a Zionist? How am I a Zionist?
So within 3 seconds of my first interview at the protest, this woman runs over to stop the conversation. And if I slow the video down, you can clearly see her getting instructions from a professional protester to run over and stop the interview from happening. Fortunately, in your effort to cover up the truth, you showed me where to look. This man is not only a professional protester, but something much worse. Watch this. Here he is leading a protest right in front of the White House, back again in New York City leading the charge, and again outside the Trump building on Wall Street. Here's where things take a horrific turn. This is him standing with a man wearing a Hamas headband. He is speaking at a vigil for Nasrallah, the former Secretary General of Hezbollah.
Well, that was just one out of quite literally hundreds of examples of people that Nate Freriedman have exposed as professional protesters. And I implore you to go to his channel to see more. And this touches on a much larger theme that I spoke to Nate about today on the podcast, which is that the Western anti-Israel movement is not some organic bottom-up movement of people, say, reading the news or seeing the images out of Gaza and then wanting to act on it. But this is a well-orchestrated, top-down, nefarious, and well-funded behemoth of people that include paid protesters, funding from foreign countries, and funding from foreign interest groups that are not just trying to take down Israel, but also trying to take down the entire edifice of liberalism and the West itself. I'm excited to bring you my conversation with Nate Freriedman as we talk about the phenomenon of paid protesters and more. And I will also give a shout out that I was lucky enough to join Nate Freriedman on his show to talk about the phenomenon of Neturei Karta, the group of ultra-Orthodox Jews that are rabidly anti-Zionist. So I implore you to go to his channel and check that out. And now I bring you Nate Freriedman. So I came upon your channel, and one of the things that you oftentimes post about, and it's been fascinating to follow you, is the rise of fake protesters at things like pro-Iranian, pro-Hezbollah, anti-Israel rallies. Talk to me a little bit about the overall phenomenon. There are some, questions I want to drill down on, but, what even prompted you to go out and try to go through all these anti-Israel rallies, trying to figure out who's a quote unquote real protester, who's fake?
Yeah. So one of the first protests I ever went to, for my YouTube channel was the takedown Tesla protests. So I went there just by myself. I wanted to interview a few people to get to know what they truly want, because these were people that loved Elon Musk before he was working with Donald Trump. I mean, he was the electric car guy. I mean, he was like the top of the Democrat Party for as far as influence was concerned. So when I got there, I had a woman just right away follow me with a right-wing troll arrow. And that was confusing because, one, I'm not a right-wing troll, but also just that she just followed me and stopped all of my interviews from happening, and which really just didn't make her case look very good at all. So I realized that was not unpaid behavior. So I did some research and proved that she was paid. But then there were more than a few of her that were following me continuously throughout the protest, even outside of the protest. When I went to go on the outside of a protest to pull one of these protesters out to interview her, one of them came outside of like one of the barriers for the protest to further prevent me. So yeah, that's how it started.
So at the encampment at UC Irvine, where I work, this is now a year and a half ago, I had noticed there were people, wearing green vests that were probably paid, in some way by some organization. I tried to make small talk, as I've seen in a lot of your videos. And, one of the, I think, standard things is, so sorry, I can't answer that question, or just sort of ignoring you. But it did sort of beg the question because, I was there, I didn't even have a camera. I wasn't there as sort of, a YouTuber or journalist. I was, a person teaching on campus, interested in actually talking to some of the encampment students. And even in some of the conversations I was trying to have, I noticed that every time I would engage somebody in a conversation, somebody else would come and be like, no, don't talk to him. He's, a Zionist or part of the Jewish community. I've noticed in a lot of your videos, people are just unwilling to talk and answer questions. I mean, what do you make of that trend? Is this, do you believe that there are people being paid to make sure people like you don't get to talk to anybody in the protest? Do you think the bulk of people at the protest are actually just, paid people that don't really know why they're there and they're just coached to not say anything? Like, what exactly is going on there?
Yeah, I mean, the bulk of the people are not paid. It's strictly like people who work for the nonprofits, people that, I can identify at hundreds of protests that are around the country and don't have proof of income elsewhere. But it's also like, you mentioned not wanting to talk, like just, it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to feel like a good person when you're supporting a cause that you feel like is righteous. If you know very little about Israel and Palestine, it's very easy to say, oh, look at what's happening in Gaza, Israel bad. But if you know nothing about October 7th, or if you know nothing about the history before October 7th, it's very easy to say, oh, Israel bad. And look at how many billions of dollars Israel has, and US is funding it. But yeah, that's if you know nothing about it. So it's very easy to feel like a good person and go to those protests. And when you're challenged on your beliefs and your thoughts, you can't support it because you know very little.
Which is kind of funny because you obviously have a lot of followers and other people who do similar work, have tons of people that are going to watch the videos. If I am taking off work, because a lot of times these rallies are middle of the day outside of some embassy or some company, I would be so thrilled if people like you showed up and asked me, hey, what am I doing here? What a great platform to be able to spread the message that I'm there for. So the sort of silence and unwilling to engage with people like you is sort of all the more stunning, because if I'm rallying for anything I care about, I don't care if you're left wing or right wing or agree with me or don't agree with me. If I think I have a good point, I want as much airtime as possible with people that are going to get out the message. And so, even if you were quote unquote a right wing troll, like that shouldn't matter. Like if you have tens or hundreds of thousands of people that are going to watch your videos, no matter what I'm protesting for, I would want to engage there. So it's even more stunning, and I think that that's been one of the I think landmark pieces of at least the anti-Israel activist slash protest group is this idea of anti-normalization, this idea that you won't actually engage with anybody because it's giving them airtime or anything like that. Needless to say, it's obviously very frustrating. In terms of just sticking on paid protesters, how widespread do you think this phenomenon is? Like, do you have, obviously we don't know a ton about this, and I'm sure you do a ton of digging, underneath and going through records and all sorts of things that I, can't even imagine. But do you have some sort of like wider theory as to how this is working, who's funding it, how widespread this is? And, because just the last thing that I'll add is one of the things that I think shocked a lot of people in America is that it seemed like there were all of these groups ready to mobilize on October 7th. Like, and again, part of me, I don't want to, dip into conspiracy theories, but at some point it doesn't even seem conspiratorial of, you have all these SJP groups and all these local city chapters of anti-Israel groups, and somehow they were dormant for some of them even years. And then all of a sudden, October 7th, that morning, they, in the case of, I think, Colombia, they restarted their Instagram account after a year and a half of being dormant on the morning of October 7th before the Hamas attacks. And like, you just sort of like get these hints that there's some sort of network happening here. So do you have a theory of everything when it comes to this?
Yeah, I mean, through my investigations, I can extrapolate that there's at least thousands of paid protesters in this country, but let's just start with what we know. So let's take the People's Forum, for example, which is funded by Roy Neville Singham, which is a billionaire who has ties to the CCP. So he's given them $20 million, and this is basically an incubator for protesters. So the People's Forum, they have a bookstore in New York City, and I identified David Chung at multiple protesters. He's a general manager at the People's Forum, protesting for fair trade with Cuba, everything he's protesting for. But this is basically an anti-America, anti-Israel, anti-capitalist forum. Their head of the People's Forum has said, when we deal the final blow to Israel, that will be the what we need to destroy capitalism. So this is just a viciously violent group. Now, they were the group that organized the Colombia protests. They are one of the many groups. I know this because it was reported, widespread reporting, that there were hundreds of protesters that went to the offices of the People's Forum, not Columbia students, by the way. I identified one person who I know for sure was not a Columbia student, get arrested at Columbia. So when Eric Adams said that there was outside agitators, he's absolutely correct about that. The People's Forum was used as like a prep like a headquarters for those Columbia protesters. It's also funded by George Soros. George Soros gives money to things like the Alliance for Global Justice, which then gives to other nonprofits. So there's like an umbrella of an umbrella of an umbrella company. We do deep dives on my channel about that. But yeah, George Soros, Roy Neville Singham are the two names that are facilitating a lot of this. Yeah.
In the case of the CCP, I know there's been a lot of research, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, of countries, China's up there, Russia, even countries like India, who are just intent on sowing both misinformation and discord within America. They've been trying to do that for 20, 30 years. Obviously, with social media, it makes it a lot easier to sort of sow misinformation. So let's just start with the CCP. Is this just a case of it's worth it for these foreign countries to pour money into people that they know are sort of, eroding the fabric of American civil life, which is, a lot of these, very illiberal protests? I mean, is it just that simple?
Yeah. I mean, I think it really, if you look at TikTok, like, I mean, there's very clear effort from China to weaken America. Let's just take the protest, because you bring up the protest. So Roy Neville Singham has said that we need to learn from China, that he's a self-described socialist, but he's also a Marxist. I mean, you look at the People's Forum, one of the most popular classes at the People's Forum is an introduction to Marxism. So if you get the United States, young people in the United States, to believe that Marxism is the right way to go about things, of course our nation will be weakened, and China will be likely to become the number one superpower if all of our young people believe that Marxism is the way to go.
Yeah. So, and thinking of Soros, it's interesting because anytime George Soros's name is mentioned, I'm sort of two immediate minds. I have looked into it, and I think I agree with you that there is a lot of nefarious funding networks. It also, obviously, you're probably won't be surprised by this, but there are a lot of anti-Semitic conspiracies that revolve around Soros funding. So I'm curious, for people that know nothing about who George Soros is and what he funds, how would you approach a conversation sort of separating anti-Semitic conspiracy theories involving George Soros from George Soros, the actual person who actually is funding initiatives that might be, hurting America or hurting Israel?
So you're basically asking, like, what is the anti-Semitic? Could you describe what the anti-Semitic conspiracy
even
theories
a little
are?
bit more, I imagine there's a good amount of people listening to this that the second you say George Soros are just immediately going to characterize you in their mind as, oh, this is just another one of those, like, yeah, blame George Soros. Obviously you're not saying it in sort of the anti-Semitic way of like all problems in society are caused by like one or two wealthy Jews, whatever. But that is on the internet, and sort of, especially, meme culture or anti-Semitic culture, you oftentimes do hear like anything bad is just like, oh yeah, that's George Soros. And so, but how would you think about, like, for somebody that knows nothing about George Soros except for the sort of vague notion that oftentimes he's evoked in an anti-Semitic way, like, who is George Soros, the real person, and what is he actually funding, and what might be his goals? Like, why would George Soros want there to be more protesters at a pro-Iran rally in New York, say?
Right. So George Soros's motivations are an enigma for the world. We don't 100% know. I mean, clearly, he's invested in the downfall of Western beliefs. Like, he clearly, through these nonprofits that he funds, he's clearly against capitalism. Elon's voice that he could be just against humanity as a whole. We really don't know. But I instruct people who are listening to this, go and look at the Soros Foundation and how much they give to the Tides Network and the Tides Foundation, and see the nonprofits that the Tides Foundation funds. See that all of these nonprofits, most of them are invested in the destruction of Israel or the destruction of Western beliefs. And you can go down the list. It's not just one or two, it's 20, 30, 40 nonprofits that he funds. As far as the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, Jewish people Jewish people are raised a little bit differently. They are taught to learn. They are taught, Jewish people do disproportionately well in the world, but it's not because of some anti-Semitic conspiracy. It's just because of a different way that we're raised. It's a value of, like I said, learning about money earlier, whatever. And so even at the top of the game for hatred towards Jews is Jewish people. Jewish people tend to do well, and that it's no exception for the people who hate Israel. People at the top of that, look at Bernie Sanders. He's one of the biggest self-hating Jewish people in the world. So,
yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I've noticed, and this probably goes, I mean, for sure it goes back before 2020, but, just the rise of protest culture on the left and what that's coincided with in terms of, one of the stunning things, I guess I'll phrase it another way, is that a lot of these movements almost seemingly bleed and evolve into each other at some point. There was actually some comedian that I was just listening to. I'm forgetting the name, but he was sort of, his whole stand-up bit is that now everything's Palestine. So there's no such thing as Black Lives Matter marches anymore. It's just Palestine, but it's like the same people and the same networks are just seamlessly switching, from one day doing A to the next day B, the next day C. I mean, how interconnected is this? Is this just, a bottom up thing of just people getting sort of taken on this social media ride where, if we were around 4 years ago, everything would be hashtag Black Lives Matter and now everything is hashtag Free Palestine? Or are there actually groups? I mean, I know there's been some preliminary reporting to just how deep Qatari money goes into things even like universities.
So you're right that a lot of the issues get interlinked. Like if you look at June, even there wasn't much about Pride Month, and it was Pride Month, but there wasn't many LGBTQ flags because the attention was being occupied by anti-ICE and anti-Palestine. So it's hard to do multiple issues at once. You have to remember that these protests are all organized by nonprofits that have a strict game plan, a strict message. And even if you are not paid, you're still going there to spread that message that you are being instructed. Even like the hands-off protest, for example, you can see the documentation of how many nonprofits were affiliated with that, strict directions of what this is about. So everyone's got directions at that protest. But anti-Israel, it's a very easy thing to incorporate because it's all about like, justice, and it's easy to hate Jews. I mean, that's been thousands of years old. It's very easy to just tack that on. So anti-ICE, yeah, like I just went to one which is an anti-ICE, anti-Palestine or anti-Israel protest, and you're right that there's a Palestine flag right next to people complaining about ICE, and I asked them like, why is it related? Well, because we'll never stop fighting for Palestine, free Palestine. Well, Black Lives Matter stop becoming a thing, right? So yeah, you're 100% right that it's hard to do multiple things at once. So 2 to 3 seems like the max.
I think a lot of times these people in some way, and like push back if you think I'm being a little bit too gentle or naive, I think in some way a lot of people are getting taken advantage of by the anti-Israel movement. I mean, I remember at UCI there was the custodian staff had a strike. This must have been a year ago or something. And so there were 40 people, mostly Hispanic, there in the middle of campus, like on strike. They wanted higher wages, whatever one thinks about, that's a separate conversation. But then I sort of watched as the SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine on campus, showed up. They grabbed signs, but then they also we're all wearing keffiyehs, and then they took out Palestinian flags. And then at some point, over the course of a few hours, half the signs were Free Palestine and half the signs were higher wages. And all of a sudden now, the 40 people protesting, they probably have no idea who these other people are. They're just happy that it seems like they're, all of a sudden now it gets a lot more attention and people on campus start to crowd around, and, it's a lot more, it attracts a lot more, attention from the university as well. And some part of me is just like, oh my God, these poor people wanted to get this one message across that they wanted, higher wages for, doing their job. And all of a sudden now for, most people looking at this is a union strike that is also radically anti-Israel. And, if they have signs globalize the Intifada, actually now pro-terrorism. So, I don't know if I'm being like too soft or too naive, but just I've seen a lot of situations like that as well. And, even unions on campus, and, I'm talking to a lot of grad students that are a part of the grad student union, and it's the same thing. It's like, some small number of people that infiltrate the union. And now the grad student union isn't just focused on getting higher wages for grad students, which is, the role of the union, but also all of half their emails are now about the colonial genocide that's happening in Israel, Gaza. And so it does seem like, this is a little bit, there's sort of the both sides there. But certainly the movement, the anti-Israel movement / pro-terrorist movement, is very well organized. I mean, it definitely is not, SJP can't just be a bunch of students that are organized together, because I've worked with students for years, and, something like that definitely, highlights a lot more top-downness than I think people oftentimes give credit to.
I mean, look at Ukraine. There's no Ukraine flags anymore at these protests. And that was the biggest thing. And, there's more death and destruction with that war now than ever before. And yet nobody is talking about it.
Yeah. So I want to pivot a little bit. This might come out of a little bit of left field, but I was, a lot of students I know follow your work, so I have some questions from them that they were curious about. There has been this general trend of, younger people on social media, such as yourself, that are aligned more with like the general right in America, and I think that fits trends nicely of especially younger men becoming more right wing. I'm curious if you can just shed a little bit of light on that phenomenon of, what you think about these general trends, what ended up prompting a lot of your journalism slash activism in these spaces.
I wouldn't say that I'm a right wing activist, but this trend that you're seeing of more people, young people going toward the right is, I just think it's a lot of the Democrats becoming so radical. Like it's not even as much of a pull from the right as much as it's just a push away from the Democrat Party. Um, Transitioning minors, like what, like if you were to say that 10 years ago, I mean, we don't want that. So that's just common sense. So it's like Trump said it on the campaign trail many times. This is just common sense. So that's what I think you're seeing. I think you're also noticing that the left just doesn't like our country. We're the greatest country in the world, and you don't see American flags in for leftist protests. You don't see it, even though the reason they're able to protest like that is because of the free speech in this country, whereas in the right loves their country. So I think it's just from that alone, it's pretty clear, like it's just a common sense thing.
Interesting. What was your sort of political awakening? I mean, did you know that you always wanted to do journalism intersecting with politics, or was there some moment, some, I don't know, historical thing that was like, oh, okay, this is what I want to do?
I mean, honestly, like 2015, I was I never actually talked about this, but in 2015, senior year of high school, I was class president of my high school, and I was basically pushed away by like everyone because I liked Trump. And this was like very, very early days of Trump. Um, I just thought it was crazy that he was this outsider who's never held political office, and he was having these riffs in the debates. He was performing extraordinarily well in the debates. And as I always felt like an outsider, I was always into entrepreneurship. I always just felt like different than other kids. So when I saw Trump, this guy who I was like known as like the real estate guy, all of a sudden just crushing it on a political debate stage, I was like, wow, that's pretty crazy. I wouldn't say it's like I really liked the guy. I was just like, oh, this is very interesting. Like I'm drawn to it. And just the fact that I didn't hate him was enough for people to be like, whoa, this is you're like, this is wrong. So that was like the very early days of the intolerance from the left, of just not being okay with a different opinion. So yeah, I would say 2015, I was started to get interested in it.
Your postings only go back, I don't know, maybe a year or 2 years. So, how did you end up being in the place that you are now, where now you have this channel and you're getting, millions of people following your work and everything like that?
About a year ago, Biden called Zelensky Putin at the NATO summit, and I watched that and I was like, this is insane. Like, this is a national security risk. Like, I need to know if people are planning to vote for him again. I'm very curious. So I started a Who Are You Voting For series, and I just asked people on both sides who they're voting for. And what that series reveals more than anything is that people on the left were voting for Kamala Harris, or at the time, at the very beginning, Biden, because he wasn't Trump or she wasn't Trump. And people who were voting for Trump were able to accurately describe all of the policies in which that he had, that they were rooting for, and maybe even didn't mention Kamala Harris when they said that they're voting for Trump. So it was just that series that I think sort of sprung the channel.
One of the, interesting, bits of your channel is you went to Israel and you really sat down with everybody. Talk to us about that. I mean, one, was that your first time in Israel? And, what were those conversations like? What did you learn actually traveling there that you don't often get, either talking to people here or in the media in America?
Yeah, so that was actually my sixth time being in Israel. I love Israel. It's a wonderful country. So yeah, I mean, some of the things that I noticed in Israel, like right off the bat, was the patriotism is incredible, like genuinely incredible. Even if you don't like Netanyahu, you show the Israeli flag. That was like one huge thing that I noticed right off the bat. Second thing I noticed right away was people talk to each other like they've known each other for years, even if they just met. there's this sense of camaraderie that I really wish that we had here. And I think a lot of people will say that we used to kind of have that. And that's why you're seeing the right sort of grow so much of love of country. Because that's like I said, that's one of the things I noticed. It's also kind of, your viewers maybe understand what I mean, but it's kind of a balagan. Like there's a lot of chaos, and there's people just live for the day. They don't live for tomorrow, and it's quite beautiful. Like you just gain more of an appreciation for life when you're in Israel. I spoke to someone in Israel, a conversation that I will never forget, and I can talk more about it if you'd like. But it was like a 6-hour conversation of someone I just met, and I was saying it was really, really, really windy, like super, super windy, and I couldn't. It was like one of like the stormiest weeks in Israel, and I couldn't sleep. And she just said like it sure beats the Rockets. So that sprung like this 6-hour long conversation. But yeah, I could talk on and on about that.
No, I love that. No, I like what you're saying about the patriotism, because one of the things that people are surprised at just because of the sad state in America is that, before October 7th, the big news story in Israel was the judicial reform and anti-judicial reform movement. And this was one of the largest movements in Israeli history, was the, against what Bibi was doing on the judicial reform. And, that's a whole other conversation we don't have to wade into. But at every anti-government protest, it was full of Israeli flags. I mean, you look at these pictures of Tel Aviv and just thousands and thousands of flags, which is, exactly what one would hope from a healthy right-left debate in a country of like, they're both proudly wearing the flags of that country and both saying like, we have competing visions because we love this country. What you said before and sort of being pushed out of the left, I've felt that also. And, so I've actually, I started off much more liberal / progressive. If you would have talked to me in 2015, I would have certainly identified as sort of a liberal / progressive. And I felt that like just every year is just like a little bit more. And then like, October 7th was sort of like a major, a final kick of, you really do have to go sort of all in, in at least certain facets of the progressive world. It's either sort of like all or nothing. There was this one quote that I think, the conservatives like to find allies, progressives like to find heretics, or something like that, which I think has very much rung true. I mean, just personally, I am uncomfortable with a lot of the stuff that Trump is doing, but still, I mean, now at least it's almost with the rise of people like Mamdani, at some point somebody's going to ask me like, do I vote against my own self-interest and safety for some vague set of values that I have? And that's becoming increasingly difficult of a proposition. And I imagine for a lot of Jews as well. I mean, it's no news to you, obviously, but just to spell out for listeners, historically, American Jews have voted between 70 and 80% liberal for the last 100 years. There's good historic reason for that. But that seems like it's changing relatively quickly. And I think, people like yourself are sort of the epitome of that rise. I mean, I work on campus, I meet hundreds of Jewish students a year, and there certainly has been a much higher increase in, my first year on campus was 2016 working. And then, obviously, so I've been through 3 Trump elections now. And, I think in 2016, it was like, no one I knew, maybe it was like one person was like, yeah, I think I'm going to vote, for Trump. And in 2024, across Hillel, and, it was literally 50-50. And I wasn't able to predict. It wasn't like, oh, everybody knows, I don't know, David's a right winger. I would talk to, I remember this one conversation, I obviously won't give her name, a female student who identifies as non-binary, who, looks the part of what you would expect from a, 19-year-old, trans student. And if you found this person, you would bet your entire life this person's, on the left. Like, it would be the easiest bet ever. And I remember talking to them, and we were talking about the election, and they said, I'm really nervous about the election next week. And I was like, yeah. I was like, what are you thinking? And they're like, well, last election, I voted for Biden, but I think I'm going to vote for Trump this time. And I was like, wait, what? And, they're like, yeah, a lot of people in like the Jewish LGBT community are actually thinking of voting for Trump, because that's been one of the most radically anti-Semitic communities. So all that's to say, I think it's such a fascinating conversation. I don't know if you have anything to add there, but the one other, just topic I wanted to get your thoughts on, and I know we recorded a podcast on your channel about this, was Neturei Karta, who is sort of always this enigmatic group that we spoke about a little bit more of their ideology on your channel. So I'll flag that and link that to listeners to go check out. But I've actually never talked face-to-face with anybody from Neturei Karta. You have in a couple of different interviews. How do you even find them? And, what is that like, when talking to them? Are they trying to push you away? Are they interested in talking to you? You know, how have some of those interactions been?
Yeah, I mean, just to add a quick note of like the previous concept we were discussing, I once talked to a couple that was wearing hostage chains that were voting for Biden, or whatever, Kamala Harris, and it was truly quite confusing, because if you saw Trump's messaging as soon as he was inaugurated or as soon as he was voted in, saying like, if you don't return the hostages, there's going to be hell to pay. Had that been the messaging on October 8th, I think things would have went very differently. He's obviously proven he's brought in so many hostages home. So I think Jewish people are starting to realize that Trump is the best president for Jewish people in the history of this country. So yeah.
Yeah, there is a little bit. I mean, I guess I'm curious to your thoughts, because there are things, and one of the other topics, and maybe we can, you know, digress a little bit if you have time.
Mhm.
I imagine a lot of people in the Jewish community will say they really appreciate Trump on Israel. They really appreciate his speaking out against anti-Semitism when the left seems content on ignoring it. But a lot of say like domestic policies around immigration make them feel uncomfortable. I know a lot of your recent videos have also been about immigration, but like what might you say to somebody, you know, and I would put myself in that category of like, listen, you know, I sort of almost have like a split screen mind on this, where like some policies I'm like, yes, thank God somebody's talking about this. Thank God we have a president who has, you know, the balls, quite frankly, to like strike Iran when we need, and, you know, help Israel do what it needs to do. On the other hand, it seems like a lot of domestic policies are outside of the scope of what I would feel comfortable with. Like, I'm curious just from, because what, you know, you obviously talk to a lot of people behind the scenes and, you know, everything. So what might you say to that approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a priority thing. It's just, at the end of the day, it's a priority thing. So if keeping 7 million Jews safe clearly is not that big of a deal to you, then if you were to vote for somebody who is anti-Israel or is not big on Israel, that's just bare bones. That's the blunt truth of it, is that you can say, oh, I like him for Israel, but not as much about here. Okay, then it's not as important to you as one might think. As far as the immigration thing is concerned, encourage them to study what's actually going on. Do you not want violent criminals to be kicked out of the country? So a lot of the people that are being deported are repeat offenders, literally child rapists that are being kicked out of this country. So I think it's very easy to see a woman crying with her children that are being deported and to say this is bad, but really look at the numbers, really look and encourage you to check out our interviews of people changing their minds in real time and seeing that, no, actually it's in bulk, it is people self-deporting, and it's also criminals that are being deported out of this country. So yeah.
One of the other, you know, sort of interesting connected things, and this has long been a paradox, I feel like, with a lot of nonprofits, is there are certain types of organizations where if they succeeded in their goal, they'd be out of jobs. And so, you know, one of the things that I know a lot of people have talked about is, you know, people who work for nonprofits surrounding the homeless crisis, where it just seems like there's been such negligence in, you know, places like Los Angeles at, you know, we are spending so much money and the problem's only getting worse. And it just seems like there's either corruption or mismanagement or sort of both together. I know you've talked about like some of the shelters there, but like what light can you shed on this tension? I mean, is this just, I guess one way to view it would be, you know, listen, in any bureaucracy, you're going to have waste and you're going to have, you know, whatever. And this is actually a really difficult problem. On the other hand, you can have the complete opposite view and just say like, no, if you're the executive director of some, you know, organization that helps homeless people and you're making $300,000 a year and the problem's getting worse, you have actually no incentive to fix it, to anywhere in between. I'm curious what you think about that topic.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct that it's an incentives problem. So you are being paid as the NGO running a homeless shelter for every homeless person that you have that is staying in the shelter. So for every bed that's occupied, you're being paid. You're not you are not getting paid for getting them to live on their own, to have a job, to become a productive member of society. So until those incentives get changed, of course, the issue will not change.
Okay, so let's go back to
Yeah.
Neturei Karta, just because, you know, anyone in the Jewish community has heard of Neturei Karta. Very few people have actually spoken to Neturei Karta. Are they open? Are they excited, like, to try to show that, you know, show you their ways? I mean, are they sort of off put by you going up to them with a microphone? What is that background like?
Yeah, so if you go up to NKUSA, you will most likely not be pushed away right away. You will probably get somebody who's hesitant to talk and then advise you to go and speak to the head guy. I spoke to that guy, but it might be different in the state that you're in. Although I think they just travel in their small group across the country, so it might be the same person. They won't talk to me anymore, unfortunately, but you can just ask them, yeah, what are their beliefs, and ease into the conversation, and absolutely, they will speak. You just have to speak to the right person, and probably wait in line, because a lot of news organizations and a lot of people want to talk to an Orthodox Jewish person who is against Israel. There's a spectacle there for sure.
Yeah, I mean it's so unfortunate when people on the anti-Israel, journalist side or activist side prop up Neturei Karta. I mean, I know we spoke about this a lot on your podcast, and I definitely implore listeners to check out that conversation. But it's such an act of tokenization. I mean, Neturei Karta, as we spoke about, I mean, there's maybe 1,000 to 2,000 people that are a part of this organization. So we're talking about like a drop in the bucket. They obviously make a lot of noise, which is sort of their MO. I do think a lot of the funding conversation about them is connected to what we started with, where I wouldn't be surprised if these same entities that are funding, some of these paid protesters are also pouring money into Neturei Karta. I mean, we know even, 15 years ago, Iran was directly giving lavish trips to the head of Neturei Karta and inviting them to Tehran for conferences and all of that. So there's definitely a lot of, nefarious dots that need to be connected here. The last conversation I had, and then if there's anything we didn't hit, I can feel free to give you the mic for a second, is in an ideal world, and I know we're very far from an ideal world, but some part of me wants to reclaim a little bit of idealism. There are, major well-funded news organizations out in the world. Yet I feel like for a lot of young people, and I'll put myself in that category, I find things on channels like yours and that I would just never see. And it doesn't even matter if it's the Wall Street Journal or New York Times or like any mainstream media isn't talking about. I have noticed a strange phenomena, and this is, I noticed this most strikingly during COVID with debates about everything from masks to the lab leak versus wet market, where oftentimes I would hear things on podcasts that then wouldn't be talked about for about a year or two. And it would be considered like conspiratorial to have these views. And then like 3 years later, the New York Times would do a podcast like this crazy new way to view the situation. And I was like, well, wait a minute. There's a lot of negative to say about Joe Rogan, but I remember thinking like, wait a minute. I remember 3 years ago, Joe Rogan did a whole podcast on this. And it's not to say everything is, ends up true being later, but like what's broken about media? Like if this is a story that's juicy, and I think it's, super important about foreign interference and, activist groups in America, like why isn't CNN and the New York Times or even the Wall Street Journal, like why aren't they sending 10 journalists to do what you're doing? Like why is it people like you who are breaking the story, which, you're very successful, but obviously you don't have the New York Times, leverage and budget and everything there. So like, what's broken here?
Well, look, to get the real answer, you'd have to do what I do and ask them, but I can theorize and say like, it could be an agenda that they're trying to fulfill, that if they go out into the street, like a lot of my interviews have broken the narratives that they prop. So if they were to go out there and film, they wouldn't be able to publish it. For example, I just spoke to an immigrant who's pro ICE. I mean, he wants ICE to come and take violent criminals out of the country. New York Times can't post that. That's not going to fit their narrative. So that's one of many, many examples. If you were to go ask people who they're voting for on the street in New York City, like I did, good luck, because here's what you're going to find. You're going to find a lot of people who are going to vote left, but aren't going to be willing to talk about it. They don't want to talk about why they're voting for Kamala Harris, because it's one reason, which they don't like Trump. And that doesn't really inspire them to talk about it because there's not much to it. And you're going to see a lot of people on the right sound eloquent and back up the policies, which defeats their narrative that the right is just white supremacists and yada yada, right? So I think it just breaks their narrative if they go out there and do what I do.
Awesome. Okay, we've been talking for a while. What else have we not discussed? Anything else that I don't know you think is interesting and important?
No, I can't think of anything right now. I think you touched on a lot. This is definitely like one of my like longer interviews, so I think we had time to discuss. I mean, I'm happy to talk, more if you have some other questions.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to stay updated, obviously, with your postings. I definitely urge my listeners to do the same. You definitely post a lot of very interesting things that are food for thought. So, maybe in 6 months from now, if you, shed more light on either the protester issue or any of these wider issues, would love to talk with you again. For now, definitely, look up Nate Freriedman on, really any social media platform. We also had a much longer conversation on Nate's platform about Neturei Karta that should be out now. So definitely go listen to that. Nate, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you mind